The night Henry Malone rode onto Etta Kendrick's land with a torch in his hand and murder in his heart, he did not expect to find a woman standing in the dark with her arms crossed and her chin lifted like she was daring the whole world to try her. The year was 1882, and the territory of New Mexico was a place where the law was whatever the richest man said it was, where land changed hands through threats and fire and silence, and where a widow alone on 40 acres was considered by most to be nothing more than a problem waiting to be solved. The summer heat had baked the earth to a deep red brown, and the mesquite and scrub grass scratched against the legs of horses and men alike, and the stars above the Pecos Valley were so thick and bright they seemed to press down against the darkness like a weight. Etta had been awake because she was almost always awake at night now. Sleep had become a stranger to her in the 14 months since her husband Thomas had died of a fever that took him in 3 days, leaving her with 40 acres of dry clay and rock, a half-dug irrigation ditch along the east fence, a milk cow, 2 horses, a small herd of 12 cattle, and a debt to the First Territorial Bank of Cimarron that she was slowly, stubbornly, week by week, paying down. She had buried Thomas herself because the nearest neighbor was 6 miles east, and she had not wanted to leave the body in the July heat. She had driven the wagon to town herself to register the death and secure the land title in her own name, and she had endured the looks of men in the land office who could not understand why she was bothering. She was 29 years old, brown from the sun, lean from working more than she ate, and she had eyes the color of creek water over limestone, a green-gray that shifted depending on the light. Her dark hair was almost always braided and pinned, and her hands were calloused and capable, and she did not cry in front of other people. She had cried plenty in private, soaking her pillow those first weeks after Thomas died, grieving the man she had loved and the future they had planned together, the children they had hoped for, the house they were going to build properly out of adobe before the next winter. But she had kept working because the land did not care about grief, and because she was not willing to let 40 acres and a debt define the ending of her story. The man who wanted that land was named Silas Greer. Silas Greer owned most of the ranching land in that part of the Pecos Valley, and he had been trying to acquire Etta's parcel since before Thomas died, because her 40 acres sat at the natural junction of 2 water draws seasonal creeks that, when the rains came right, gave the land something valuable that the surrounding range didn't have: reliable water access. Greer's cattle operation needed that water corridor. Without it, he had to move his herds 3 miles north every dry season, and in the drought years that were coming more frequently to that part of New Mexico, 3 miles could mean the difference between a profitable operation and dead cattle. He had offered Thomas Kendrick money for the land. Thomas had declined. He had sent a lawyer to Etta after the funeral with a revised and generous offer. Etta had declined, politely but with a firmness that left no room for negotiation. He had then applied pressure through the bank, which he had partial interest in, suggesting that Etta's repayment schedule might need to be accelerated. Etta had driven into Cimarron, sold half her cattle, and made a lump payment that put her 2 months ahead instead of behind. She had done this with the kind of focused rage that doesn't shout, it just works harder. By the August of 1882, Silas Greer had run out of patience and had decided to solve the problem the way that men with money and no conscience often solved problems in the New Mexico territory. He would simply make the land undesirable, burn the homestead, destroy the well casing, remove the evidence that anyone had been cultivating the land, and with no home and no water source, the widow would have no choice but to take whatever he offered and move on. He had hired Henry Malone for this task. Henry Malone was 26 years old, and he had been working for Silas Greer for 11 months, which was 11 months longer than he had intended when he first rode into the territory looking for writing work. He had come from Texas, from a hardscrabble life near San Angelo, where his father had worked other men's cattle until the work killed him, and Henry had decided early that he would not do the same, that he would find a way to something better, though he had never been entirely certain what better looked like or how to get to it. He had a talent with horses and a good eye and a straight back in the saddle, and he had been hired by Greer's foreman on the strength of those things, and for 11 months he had ridden line and fixed fence and moved cattle and tried not to look too closely at the way Greer conducted his business. But he had been looking. He was always looking. He had eyes that noticed things, dark brown eyes under a battered hat brim, set in a face that was weathered but not yet hardened, a face that was still capable of expression if he allowed it. He had noticed that 2 homesteaders east of the Greer Range had left their claims in the past year under circumstances that felt wrong. He had noticed that the foreman, a thick-necked man named Cutter, sometimes rode out with certain men on certain nights and came back without explaining where he'd been. He had noticed that the bunkhouse talk sometimes went quiet when he walked in, as if he was not quite trusted with the full scope of things. When Cutter had pulled him aside 2 days ago and told him what needed doing at the widow Kendrick's place, Henry had felt something cold and certain settle in his chest. He had said yes because he was afraid to say no, afraid of what men like Cutter did with refusals, and also because a desperate part of him had thought, maybe I'll just scare her enough. Maybe if she sees the torch she'll take the money and go somewhere safer, and no one will actually get hurt. He had told himself this on the ride out. He had repeated it as he lit the torch from his saddlebag flint and rode through the fence gap Cutter had told him about. And then he had crested the small rise and seen the woman standing outside her front door in the dark, holding a lantern, looking at him like she had been waiting. She had been waiting. She had heard the horse at the fence gap. She had learned the sounds of her land the way a person learns a piece of music, every creak and rhythm of it. And she had known that a rider in the dark, coming through her fence line without calling out, was not a neighbor bringing good news. She had taken down the rifle from above the door, then after a moment's consideration, set it inside and just come outside with the lantern, because she had decided that a gun might invite a gun, and she wanted to look at whoever this was before she decided how afraid to be. Henry pulled his horse up short when he saw her, and the torch in his hand felt suddenly enormous and obvious and shameful, like a child caught with something he shouldn't have. She said, "I can see what you've got in your hand. I expect you can see my face. So let's not pretend we don't both know what this is." Her voice was steady. Not fearless, he could hear the controlled, careful effort in it, the way a person sounds when they are holding themselves together by will, but it was a steady voice. Direct. There was no begging in it. Henry did not say anything for a moment. He was looking at her face in the lantern light and the torch light, and she was looking back at him, and the night was very quiet except for the sound of his horse blowing air through its nostrils and the distant call of a nighthawk somewhere over the draw. "I know who sent you," she said. "Greer has made his position very clear, and I expect you've been told what to do here." Henry still did not speak. She said, "So I want to ask you something, and I want you to actually think about it before you do whatever it is you came to do." She paused. "Is this the man you decided to be? When you were young and things were different, is this what you saw for yourself?" It was such an unexpected question that something in his throat tightened uncomfortably. He had not been asked about himself in a long time. He had been given orders and ridden places and done things, and no one had looked at him and asked him about himself. He looked down at the torch. It was burning steadily, the flame leaning a little in the warm night wind. Without entirely understanding why, he leaned over the side of his horse and drove the end of the torch into the dry earth and held it there until the flame guttered and went out. He straightened up and looked at the woman with the lantern, and she was watching him with an expression he couldn't fully read, cautious, assessing, something that might have been relief if she was allowing herself to feel it. "No," he said, and his voice was rougher than he intended, scraped out from somewhere honest. "It is not what I saw for myself." She let out a long, slow breath. Then she said, "Good. Because I have a section of irrigation ditch that needs finishing before the dry season ends, and it would take me another 2 weeks to do it alone, and I cannot afford to hire someone." She looked at him steadily. "You need somewhere to go that isn't back to Greer tonight, I imagine. So you can sleep in the barn and start digging at first light." Henry Malone stared at the woman for a long moment, certain he had misunderstood. She turned and walked back to her front door, then stopped and looked over her shoulder. "There's a blanket on the stall door and a bucket of oats for your horse." "Good night, Mr. Malone," he said. "Henry Malone." "Good night, Mr. Malone, I'm Etta Kendrick," and she went inside and closed the door. He sat on his horse in the dark for a while after that, looking at the closed door and the glow of the lantern visible through the oilcloth window, and then he looked at the cold torch stub driven into the earth, and then he looked at the barn, which was small and weathered but solid, with a lantern hook by the door and a water trough that was actually full. He rode to the barn. In the morning, Henry woke before the sun was fully up, disoriented by the smell of hay and cattle, and the absence of the bunkhouse sounds he was used to. He lay on the barn floor on the blanket she had mentioned, which was old but clean, and he stared at the board ceiling and thought about what he had done last night and what it meant. What it meant was that he had failed to complete a job Cutter had given him, and when Cutter found out, and Cutter would find out, because Cutter's men watched things, there would be consequences. He was not sure exactly what form those consequences would take, but Silas Greer was not a man who accepted failure with grace, and Henry had no illusions about the kind of loyalty Greer extended to men who did not perform. What it also meant was that he had nowhere particular to go. He had $42 in his saddlebag, which was all he had saved in 11 months after Greer's operation took their cut for board and supplies, and he had no family waiting anywhere, and no land of his own, and no plan beyond the next day. He had been riding on a kind of deliberate blankness for a long time, not thinking too far ahead because thinking ahead required hope, and hope was something he'd been rationing carefully. He heard the sound of the back door to the house opening, and then the sound of someone moving in the yard with purpose, and he got up and brushed hay off his shirt and stepped outside. Etta Kendrick was at the well, drawing water for the morning. She was already fully dressed in work clothes, a worn skirt, a cotton blouse, a leather vest that had probably belonged to her husband once, heavy boots. Her hair was braided back. She did not look up when he came out of the barn. "There's a shovel leaning on the south fence," she said. "Coffee will be ready in about 15 minutes if you want to come inside first." He said, "You're not afraid of me." She stopped cranking the well and looked at him. "I was last night. I'm still a little afraid. But you put out the torch, so I'm working with the information I have." She went back to cranking the well. "Coffee in 15 minutes. He went and found the shovel. She had been working on the irrigation ditch. She explained over coffee at the rough-hewn kitchen table, since the previous spring. The ditch ran from the eastern water draw along the base of the property for about 400 yards, meant to direct the seasonal water flow toward her garden plots and the cattle pasture instead of letting it drain off the slope and disappear into Greer's land below. Thomas had surveyed it, and they had started it together the last summer before he died, getting about 120 yards of it dug before the fever took him, and everything stopped. "If I can finish it before the fall rains," she said, "I'll have enough water coming into the pasture to last the dry months. I've got 12 head. If the water's right, I can carry them through." Henry drank his coffee, which was strong and black and better than anything made in the Greer bunkhouse, and looked at the hand-drawn map she had spread on the table, a surprisingly precise drawing with measurements and grade markings. "You drew this yourself?" he asked. "Thomas drew the original. I've updated it. I took some lessons in surveying from a man in Cimarron, who was trained as an engineer before he came west." She said it without apology or explanation, as if it were simply a thing she had done because it needed doing. "The grade needs to drop 4 inches over the last 100 yards to keep the flow moving. If it's off, the water pools and evaporates." He studied the map and said, "You want the outlet here at the south corner of the pasture?" "Yes, there's a natural depression there. It'll form a small stock pond if the ditch works right." He nodded and said, "That'll work. You might want to put a small check dam about 50 yards up from the outlet to slow the water and let it spread instead of cutting a channel. Otherwise, in a hard rain, you get a rush and it digs out the bottom of the ditch." She looked at him over her coffee cup. "Where did you learn that?" "My father worked irrigation on a farm in central Texas when I was 12. I dug a lot of ditches before I ever got on a horse." He looked at the map again. "You'll need rock for the check dam. There's limestone coming up along the east side of the draw. I noticed it riding in, close enough to carry without a wagon." She was quiet for a moment, and he had the sense that she was recalibrating something. Then she said, "All right. We'll start at the existing end and work south. I'll show you what's been done." They worked through the morning side by side, and it was hard physical work. The earth in that part of New Mexico was dense red clay laced with rock, and every foot of progress required a combination of pickaxe and shovel, and sometimes a pry bar she kept along the fence line for exactly this purpose. Henry was strong and had a good rhythm to the work, and by mid-morning he had settled into the labor with something that felt close to relief, the way certain kinds of honest physical effort can clear a person's mind of things they'd rather not think about. He noticed that Etta could swing a pickaxe competently. She was not performing helplessness for his benefit. She had genuinely been doing this work alone for months, and she was not the kind of woman who stopped because something was difficult. She had a way of working that was efficient and without waste, each motion considered, and she didn't talk unnecessarily while she was working, which he respected. Around midday she said, "Greer will know you didn't do what he sent you to do." "Yes." "Will he send someone else?" Henry straightened up and looked out across the flat toward the direction of the Greer range. "Probably not right away. Cutter will want to know what went wrong first. That buys some time." "How much?" "A few days, maybe a week if Greer's occupied with other business." At her, "You need to be thinking about what you're going to do when the pressure comes back. It will come back." She looked at the ditch they had dug and the ditch that remained, and then at her cattle grazing in the near pasture, and then at the house, which was small and made of adobe with a good roof that she had patched herself last fall. "I have been thinking about it for 14 months, she said. "The answer is always the same: I'm not leaving." "Then you're going to need some allies, people who will stand with you." "I have some. Milo Hatch east of here, he's had his own trouble with Greer and he's steady. And the Montoya family has grazed their sheep on my land by arrangement, and we look out for each other. But a rancher with money and a foreman like Cutter doesn't worry much about neighbors." "No," Henry agreed. "He doesn't." They went back to digging. By the end of the first day they had added 60 yards to the ditch, which was more progress than Etta had made alone in a week. Henry took dinner at her kitchen table. She made a simple bean and bacon stew that was plain but filling, and they talked about the work plan for the next day and the placement of the check dam, and it was a conversation between people who were both practical and careful, circling around the larger questions without quite approaching them. After dinner, Henry helped her carry the dishes to the wash basin and then said, "I'll stay in the barn again if that's agreeable." She said, "That's agreeable." And then after a moment, "Malone, I want to ask you something." "Go ahead." "When you put out that torch last night, was that a decision or was it just hesitation?" He thought about that seriously because she was asking seriously. "I think it started as hesitation," he said, "but by the time the flame went out it was a decision." She looked at him for a moment and then nodded as if this was the right answer. "Good night, Mr. Malone." "Good night, Mrs. Kendrick." He lay in the barn that night and felt something he had not felt in a very long time, something that was not exactly peace but was adjacent to it, the sensation of having made a right choice and having the ground be solid under his feet because of it. The next 3 days settled into a rhythm that surprised them both. Rise before the sun. Coffee at the kitchen table. Work. Midday rest in the shade during the worst heat. Work again until the light failed. Dinner. Brief, careful talk. Sleep. The ditch was progressing well. Henry had found the limestone outcropping along the draw and had begun collecting and shaping rocks for the check dam, and Etta had watched him work with stone with the same quiet assessment she turned on everything, learning the pattern of how he thought. On the third evening, sitting on the front steps after dinner because the kitchen held the day's heat too long, Henry told her about his father. He was not sure why he started, something about the quiet and the stars, and the fact that she had a way of listening that didn't press. But he found himself talking about San Angelo and the cattle ranch his father had worked for 30 years, and how his father had died of a fall from a horse on someone else's land, and how he had left Henry exactly nothing except the knowledge of how to ride, and a worn Bible that Henry had subsequently lost on the road somewhere in eastern New Mexico. Etta listened without interrupting, and when he was done, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Thomas wanted to name this land something. He used to say every piece of ground deserves a name the way every horse does. He never decided before he died." She paused. "I've been thinking of calling it the Double K for Kendrick, though it seems a big name for 40 acres. Size doesn't much matter to a name," Henry said. "Big names fit small places fine." She looked at him sideways. "That might be the first philosophical thing I've heard you say. I have my moments." She smiled at that, the first full smile he had seen from her, and it did something considerable to her face, softening it and brightening it at the same time, revealing a warmth that all the practical capability of her tended to conceal. He noticed that smile the way you notice a landscape when the clouds shift and the light changes all at once. He looked away and found something interesting to study on the horizon. On the fourth day, Cutter rode in. Henry was in the north pasture checking on the stock when he heard the rider, and he recognized Cutter's gray horse at 200 yards. His hands did not shake, which surprised him. He walked back toward the house at a steady pace. Etta was already standing in the yard by the time Cutter reached the gate. Henry came alongside her and stood slightly behind her left shoulder. Cutter was a thick man in his 40s with a face like hammered leather and eyes that were small and pale and calculating. He looked at Henry first, then at Etta, then back at Henry. "Malone," he said, his voice flat, "you missed some work." "I left Greer's employment," Henry said. "I'm working this claim now." Cutter's pale eyes moved over Henry's face with the practiced look of a man who is calculating angles. Then he smiled, which was not a pleasant thing to see. "That's so. You know Mr. Greer's got an interest in this property," Etta said. "Mr. Greer has an interest in acquiring my property. That's a different thing entirely, and I've made my position on the matter clear on multiple occasions." Her voice was level and hard. "You're trespassing, Mr. Cutter. I'd like you to leave." Cutter turned his small eyes on her. "Mrs. Kendrick, you're a woman alone out here. That's a complicated situation for a person. Mr. Greer is prepared to make a fair offer. He's made offers before and I've declined them. The answer hasn't changed. Please get off my land." There was a silence. Cutter looked at Henry again, making a slow, deliberate assessment. Then he reached up and touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers, a contemptuous gesture, not a respectful one, and turned his horse. "We'll talk again," he said over his shoulder. Henry watched Cutter ride out through the gate and down the road until he was gone. Then he looked at Etta, whose jaw was set and whose hands, he noticed, were pressed flat against her skirt, the only sign she gave that the encounter had frightened her. "He'll report back to Greer," Henry said, "and Greer will decide what to do next." "I know." She smoothed her skirt carefully. "Well, there's still 50 yards of ditch to dig." She walked back to the south fence and picked up her pickaxe. He followed her. They finished the main channel of the ditch on the afternoon of the 5th day. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no ceremony to it, just a point where the last section of clay and rock gave way and the earth was open and graded the full 400 yards from the draw to the stock pond depression in the south pasture. They stood side by side looking at it, both of them dirt-caked and tired, and the satisfaction of it was large and quiet. "It works," Etta said. It was a statement, but there was something in it that sounded like relief and wonder and maybe other things too. "Check dam still needs building," Henry said. And you'll want to reinforce the first section where the grade change is sharpest. But yes, it works. She looked at him, and the late afternoon sun was behind him, so she had to squint a little, and she said, "Why are you still here, Henry Malone?" He had been calling her Etta by the third day, by mutual unstated agreement. She had just called him by his full name, and it felt intentional, like she was trying to get at something true. "I don't have anywhere better to be," he said. "That's not an answer." He looked at the ditch and then at the sky and then at her. "I'm here because I want to be here," he said. "Because this is the first honest work I've done in a long time, and because," he stopped. "Because," she said. He shook his head slightly, not in negation but in the manner of a man who doesn't have the right words yet. "Because you're worth standing next to," he said finally, and it came out quieter than he intended. Etta looked at him for a long moment. There were things moving in her face, not performances of emotion but actual ones, the kind that a careful person lets you see for a second before they compose themselves. Then she said, "The check dam isn't going to build itself," and walked back toward the house to get water before the last light was gone. Henry stood there with the shovel in his hand and the ditch at his feet and the sky going gold and pink, and he thought that he was in very serious trouble, and for the first time in a long time, the trouble felt like something worth being in. 2 days later, Milo Hatch rode over from his place 6 miles east. Milo Hatch was 53, a rancher who had come to the Pecos Valley from Kansas 12 years before and who had built a solid operation through patience and steady work. He was a heavy-set man with a kind face and a white beard that he kept neatly trimmed, and he had liked Etta Kendrick and admired Etta and worried about her since the funeral. He pulled his horse up at the gate and called out a hello, and Etta came to the fence with genuine warmth. "Heard you had some trouble," Milo said, looking carefully at Henry, who was stacking stone near the ditch outlet. "Cutter came by," Etta said. "We're all right." Milo watched Henry for a moment. "Who's the man with the stone?" "Henry Malone. He was working for Greer. He isn't anymore." She said it simply, and Milo looked at her and then at Henry and then back at her. "That's so," Milo said. He raised his voice. "Malone, you want to come say hello?" Henry set down his stone and walked over and shook Milo's hand, and Milo looked him up and down with the frank assessment of a man who has learned to read people by necessity. "You know what Greer will do," Milo said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes, sir," Henry said. "I expect he'll move on a legal angle next, since the direct approach hasn't worked. He'll look for something with the claim filing or the bank debt." Milo nodded slowly. "He's already been talking to Judge Alderman in Cimarron." "Alderman is Greer's man, has been for years." He looked at Etta. "I've been thinking you need a lawyer. There's a man in Santa Fe, came out here from Cincinnati, name of Carver. He's handled land cases. Knows the territorial statutes. He's not cheap, but he's honest, which around here counts for more." Etta said, "I can't afford Santa Fe." "I know," Milo said. "I'm prepared to make you a loan at 0 interest. You can pay it back when the ditch brings your cattle through the dry season and you've got a stronger operation." He said it quickly, as if he knew she would want to object, and he wanted to get the words out before she could. She was quiet. "Etta," Milo said more gently, "Thomas was my friend. And you're one of the few people I trust out here. Let me help." Henry watched Etta's face and saw the war there, her independence against her practicality, the woman who had managed alone for over a year against the one who understood that managing alone had limits. "The loan needs to be written down," she said finally, "properly, with terms." Milo smiled. "We can write it on a flour sack if you've got something better than a flour sack to use." She went inside and came back with paper. Milo went to Santa Fe by the end of the week, which was a favor beyond what had been asked, because he said he needed to check on some business there anyway, and it was not entirely a lie. He sent a letter back 4 days later, saying that Carver would come to Cimarron by the middle of September and would review Etta's claim documents. Meanwhile, the pressure from Greer came in a new form. A man from the bank arrived at the property to announce that the terms of Etta's loan had been reviewed and that a balance review was required within 30 days. It was not quite a foreclosure notice, but it was the architecture of one. Henry took the notice and read it carefully. He had learned to read through necessity and not through schooling, and he read slowly but thoroughly, and when he was done he said, "This is a squeeze play. They're trying to get you to miss a payment or fail a review so they can claim you're in default." "I know what it is," Etta said, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the wood. "How close are you to your next scheduled payment?" 3 weeks. "And you can make the payment?" "Yes. I sold eggs to the Montoya family last week and I've got 2 calves I can sell at the Cimarron market." She was going through it in her head, calculating. "I can make the payment. But if they keep accelerating the review schedule, eventually it becomes impossible to stay ahead of it." "That's what they're counting on," Henry said. He sat down across from her. "Etta, I have $42. She looked at him. "I can't take your money. It's not charity, call it an investment." "In what?" He met her eyes. "In this place." She held his gaze for a moment and then looked down at the table. "Henry," she said, and something in the way she said his name, quiet and careful and with a kind of weight behind it, made him very still. "What?" he said. She shook her head slowly. "I don't know how to do this." "Do what?" She looked up at him. "You came here to burn down my home," she said, and it was a plain statement, not an accusation. "Yes," he said. "And now you're here offering to invest your last $42 in my cattle operation." She said it not with irony but with a kind of wondering directness, as if she was trying to understand the geography of it. "People change course," he said. "Sometimes fast when the right thing makes them." He paused. "I'm sorry for what I came here to do. I've been sorry every day since." "I know you have," she said softly. "I can see it." They sat in the kitchen for a while after that without speaking, and the silence was not uncomfortable. The evening light came through the oilcloth window and made a warm pattern on the table, and outside one of the horses stamped in the corral, and somewhere north of the house the cattle were settling. Henry said, "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "What did Thomas look like?" She was quiet for a moment, and then she went to the shelf above the fireplace and took down a small framed photograph, a daguerreotype in a case, the kind taken at a studio. She handed it to Henry. Thomas Kendrick had been a broad-shouldered man with a straightforward face and calm eyes and a mustache. He looked like a person who was good at things and quietly proud of it. Henry handed it back carefully. "He looks like a good man." "He was," Etta said. "He was steady and honest, and he could fix almost anything, and he made me laugh every day. I miss him every day." She replaced the photograph with care. "But I'm still here, and the land is still here." Henry said nothing, only nodded. She looked at him then and said, "Do you know what I thought when you put out that torch?" "No." "I thought, that is a man who isn't finished yet." She said it with simplicity, as though it were an observable fact like the grade of a ditch or the height of water in a well. "People who are finished don't make decisions. They just do what they're told." Henry was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I don't want to make you uncomfortable." She said, "You don't make me uncomfortable." She paused. "You make me something else. I'm not ready to say what yet." He accepted that with a nod, and they went back to their separate silences. But the silence between them had changed. It was warmer now, more inhabited. The kind of quiet that 2 people share when they are both thinking about the same thing and neither one is quite ready to speak it out loud. 3 days after that, the Montoya family came. Ramon and Consuela Montoya ran a sheep operation on the edge of the eastern draw, and they had been Etta's neighbors in the genuine sense of the word. The kind who appeared when something needed doing, who sent food when times were hard, who asked nothing and received the same consideration in return. Ramon was a solidly built man of about 40 with a thick black mustache and serious eyes, and Consuela was small and quick and capable, and they brought their 2 eldest sons with them when they came riding up the road late in the morning. "We heard Cutter has been on your land," Ramon said. He looked at Henry with the same careful assessment Milo had applied, and when Etta introduced Henry as a man who was helping her, Ramon shook his hand and said, "Good. She needs someone who can lift more than she can." "He can lift a shovel," Etta said, with a tone that was dry and almost laughing. "So can my sons," Ramon said. "We came to help with the check dam." They built the check dam that afternoon. Henry and Ramon and the two Montoya boys, a young man of 20 named Esteban and his brother Tomas, who was 18, both of them strong and quick at stone work. Etta and Consuela laid the foundation courses and Henry and Ramon set the upper work, and by evening the dam was built, a solid V-shaped stone structure angled to spread the flow across the outlet channel, exactly the kind of thing Henry had seen work on Texas farmland and believed would work here. When it was done, Ramon looked at it and then at Henry and said, "You know your way around water work." "Some," Henry said. "Greer has been pushing the Montoya family off grazing land he doesn't own," Consuela said quietly. She was looking at Etta as she said it. "The land east of the draw, it has been Montoya grazing land for 30 years. His men put up wire 3 weeks ago." Etta looked at her. "He put up wire on your grazing land. Not legally his, but the wire is there." Consuela's voice was carefully controlled, carrying a grief and a frustration that was older than any of this, the kind that belonged to families who had watched their rights erased incrementally for years. "We have no paper for the grazing land. It was custom and use. Custom and use counts for less every year." Henry thought about the lawyer Milo was bringing from Santa Fe. "There may be something that can be done about that," he said carefully. "If the grazing has been continuous and documented by witnesses, by anyone who can swear to it, there might be a legal argument for use rights." Ramon looked at him sharply. "You know about land law." "Not much, but the lawyer Milo Hatch is bringing to Cimarron might. It would be worth asking." Consuela looked at Etta and Etta said, "When Carver comes, you come too. All of us together is better than each of us alone." Ramon was quiet for a moment, and then he nodded slowly, and the gesture meant more than agreement. It meant something like trust extended, which was not a small thing from a man who had been given many reasons not to extend it. They had dinner together that evening, all of them at Etta's table and the extra plank bench she kept in the barn for large gatherings. Consuela had brought bread and dried peppers and a bottle of red wine from the Montoya root cellar, and Etta had a pot of venison stew that she had started that morning. And the table was loud and full and warm in a way the little house had not been for a long time. Henry sat between Esteban Montoya and Milo's empty chair, Milo not present but somehow present anyway, his absence at the table feeling like the absence of someone expected rather than gone. And he looked at the room and felt something shift in him that he would not fully understand until much later. He was looking at a life. A real one, with difficult neighbors and hard ground and financial precarity, and work that never quite finished, and also good food and honest people and a woman at the head of the table who had not given up. He was looking at something worth building, and the recognition of it was both clarifying and frightening, because wanting something real means risking the loss of it. After the Montoyas left, Etta stood in the yard watching their lantern bob away down the road, and Henry stood a few feet away watching the same thing, and after the lantern disappeared she said, "It's a good thing having people around a table." "It is," he said. She turned to him in the dark. The moon was up, enough light to see by. "Henry, what are you going to do after, when Greer is handled one way or another, when the ditch is finished and the dam is set? What do you want?" He looked at her steadily. "Is that a question about me or about us?" The word "us" surprised them both. She looked at him and he looked at her, and the night was very still. She said slowly, "I think it might be both." He took a step toward her and she did not step back. He said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly, even if the honest answer is that it's too soon or wrong or unwelcome." "Ask," she said. "Did you mean what you said about not being uncomfortable around me?" "Yes." "Because I want you to understand something." He paused and chose his words carefully, because he was a man who, when the important moments came, wanted to say the true thing. "I came here meaning to destroy what you'd built, and you gave me a shovel instead. And every day since I've been more grateful for that than I know how to say." And he stopped again, looking at her in the moonlight. "And," she said softly, "and I am falling in love with you," he said. And I know the timing is complicated, and I know what I was, and I know you've got every reason in the world to tell me to go sleep in the barn and keep a proper distance. And I will do that if that's what you want. And I'll still help you fight Greer because it's the right thing regardless. But I wanted to be honest with you about it. Etta Kendrick, who had managed 40 acres alone for 14 months, who had buried her husband and paid her debt and dug a ditch and stood down a foreman, was quiet for a moment that felt very long. Then she said, "Thomas died 14 months ago. I loved him completely. I still love the memory of him, and I am not so far along in the grief that I think it's gone." "I know," Henry said. "But grief doesn't mean done," she said. "It just means the shape of things is different." She reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were calloused and warm and steady, and the touch was simple and direct, no performance in it, no hesitation once she decided. "I'm not ready to call it anything yet," she said, "but I want you to stay, not just to help with Greer. I want you to stay." Henry closed his hand around hers and said, "I'll stay." They stood there in the yard holding hands in the moonlight for a while, and nothing else was said because nothing else needed to be said quite yet, and the sky was very clear and full of stars, and somewhere on the far pasture one of the cattle called once and was answered and was quiet. The following week brought Mr. Carver. He arrived in Cimarron by stage on the 14th of September, a small, energetic man in his 40s with a vest full of papers, and the kind of precise eyes that are always reading something. Milo met him at the stage and brought him out to the Double K on the second day, and Etta had prepared the kitchen table with her land documents, the original homestead claim, the bank papers, Thomas's survey notes, her own updated survey, the letters from Greer's lawyer, and a carefully organized record of every payment she had made to the bank, dated and initialed. Carver went through the documents with absolute concentration while Etta sat across from him, and Henry stood in the doorway and Milo sat in the corner chair and said nothing. It took the better part of 2 hours. When Carver was done, he placed all the papers in a neat stack and looked up. "Your claim is clean," he said. "The filing is proper, the title is clear, and your payment record is impeccable. There is no legitimate legal basis for acceleration of the loan, and if the bank attempts to pursue that avenue, we can challenge it successfully." He paused. "The harder problem is Greer's influence over Judge Alderman. Even with clean papers, a biased court can create delays and costs that wear a person down." "What do we do about that?" Etta asked. "We don't fight it in Alderman's court," Carver said. "We take it to the territorial court in Santa Fe. I have standing there, and I know the judge, who is not Greer's man. If Greer tries a legal angle, we move immediately to the territorial level and make the whole thing visible, newspapers in Santa Fe, letters to the territorial governor, public record." He looked at Etta steadily. "The best defense against corruption is sunlight. The moment Greer's land pressure campaign becomes a matter of public record at the territorial level, it becomes much riskier for him. He's a big man in Pecos Valley, but he's not important enough to survive a scandal that reaches Santa Fe." Henry said from the doorway, "Will he know we're prepared to do that?" "He will as of tomorrow," Carver said, with something that might have been satisfaction. "I intend to pay a call on Greer's lawyer in Cimarron and make the situation very clear. Men like Greer calculate risk. We need to change his calculation." The Montoyas came that afternoon, and Carver spent an hour with Ramon, listening carefully to the history of their grazing land, the dates, the witnesses, the continuous use going back to Ramon's father's time. He made notes and asked careful questions, and when he was done he said, "Custom and use is harder to argue than title, but it's not impossible, particularly when the encroachment is recent and the use record is strong. I'll look into the original land grants for that area." Consuela, who had been listening from the doorway, said quietly, "Will it matter? The law has not always been concerned with what our family has." She said it without bitterness, just plainness, the plain statement of a woman who has learned from experience how much weight she is permitted by the structures around her. Carver looked at her directly. "It should matter, and in this case I believe I can make it matter. I will not promise outcomes I cannot guarantee, but I will work this case as hard as I have worked anything." She held his gaze for a moment and then nodded, and it was the same nod Ramon had given trust extended, carefully, from a long distance. That evening, after Carver and Milo had gone to Cimarron for the night, Etta and Henry sat on the front steps again in the late warmth. Etta had her feet up on the step below and her arms wrapped around her knees, and Henry sat beside her with his forearms on his knees and his hat off, and they could hear the cattle and the crickets and the distant sound of the water moving in the new ditch, a sound that had not existed a week ago and that was beautiful for that reason, water finding its way to where it was needed. "Do you believe him?" Henry asked. "Carver." "Yes," Etta said. "He's the kind of man who means what he says." She paused. "Do you think Greer will back down?" Henry considered this honestly. "I think Greer will test the limits first. He'll push once more to see if the threat is real. But I think when he understands that Carver means to take it to Santa Fe, he'll decide the trouble isn't worth it. He's got plenty of land. He wants yours because it's convenient, not because it's everything. When convenience becomes expensive, he'll find another direction." Etta was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know him well. I worked for him for 11 months. I know how he thinks. That must be a strange thing to carry." "It is," he said simply. He turned his head to look at her profile in the fading light, the clean line of her jaw, the way she held her chin up even when she was just sitting thinking. "Etta, can I ask you something?" "You've asked me that before and I always say go ahead, so go ahead." He almost smiled. "The night I came here, you could have had a rifle on me. You could have sent me off and gotten the Montoya boys to watch the perimeter until I was gone. You didn't have to give me any reason to stay. Why did you?" She was quiet for a long time. The sky was going from orange to deep blue and the first stars were beginning. "Because you were unhappy," she said finally. "I could see it. Not just nervous or calculating, genuinely unhappy. Like a man who has been going the wrong direction for a long time and knows it and doesn't know how to stop." She looked at her hands. "Thomas always said the worst thing in the world is knowing you're wrong and not being able to choose different. He was talking about himself once, early in our marriage, when he'd made a poor decision about some cattle, but it applies broadly." Henry said, "He sounds like he was wise." "He had moments," she said, with a soft fondness that was grief and love together, the way those things can live in the same breath for a person who has loved well and lost. "He would have liked you, I think." Once he was finished being furious about the torch, Henry let out a sound that was almost a laugh, surprised out of him. "That's a very specific compliment." "I'm a very specific person," she said. She unfolded herself from the step and stood, brushing her skirt, and looked down at him. "Come inside. I made apple cake this morning and I forgot to bring it out after dinner." He stood and she was close to him, closer than the step had made it apparent, and for a moment they were simply standing near each other in the evening air, and she looked up at him without moving away. He said, very quietly, "Etta," she said, "I know." He leaned down and kissed her very gently, more a question than a statement, and she answered it clearly by not pulling away, but by lifting her hand to his jaw for a moment, one hand warm against his face in the cooling evening. Then she stepped back and said, "Apple cake," in a voice that was steady and warm and had a smile in it, and went inside. Henry stood on the steps for a moment in the dark, with his heart making entirely inconvenient amounts of noise in his chest, looking up at the stars over the double K. Then he went inside for apple cake. Greer's next move came 10 days later, and it was exactly what Henry had predicted, a testing push. 2 of Greer's riders came to the property line and made a show of measuring along the fence, asserting loudly within earshot that the east fence of the Kendrick claim was 3 yards over the property line, and that they were there to note it for formal dispute. Henry went to the fence line and stood there while they measured and noted, and he said nothing and did nothing, only watched with the careful attention of a man who is memorizing details. When they were gone, he and Etta rode to Cimarron and sent a letter to Carver in Santa Fe, and Carver's response arrived 4 days later. He had filed at the territorial level and had sent formal notice to Greer's lawyer that any land dispute challenge would be adjudicated in Santa Fe under territorial jurisdiction and not in Judge Alderman's court. Within a week, the riders did not come back. It was not a dramatic defeat. There was no confrontation, no scene, no moment of obvious triumph. Greer simply redirected his energies because Carver was right, because men like Greer calculate, and because the calculation had shifted against him. The east fence was not formally disputed. The bank's review request was quietly withdrawn. The pressure simply lifted, the way a heavy weather pattern lifts when the wind shifts, gradually and then all at once. Etta stood at her kitchen table one morning in early October with a letter from Carver, stating that the bank had confirmed her payment schedule was in good standing, and no acceleration was pending. And she read it twice, and then set it down and pressed both hands flat on the table and breathed. Henry was at the stove making coffee, and he turned and saw her face and set the pot down. She looked up at him, and her eyes were bright, not quite tears, but close, the overflow of something that had been held under pressure for a very long time. "It's over," she said. He crossed to her and she met him halfway, and he put his arms around her and she put her face against his shoulder and held on, and they stood like that in the kitchen of the Double K for a long time while the coffee pot began to steam on the stove. She was shaking very slightly, the kind of trembling that comes after sustained effort, the body releasing what the will had been holding back. He held her steadily and said nothing because there was nothing to say, and she cried a little quietly against his shoulder, not grief exactly, more like relief finding its way out the only path available. After a while she lifted her head and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and said, "That's the first time I've cried since the funeral." "It was time," he said. She looked at him with red-rimmed eyes and a completely unguarded expression, and she said, "What am I going to do with you, Henry Malone?" "I have some thoughts about that," he said, "when the time is right." She looked at him and understood exactly what he meant and said, "Make the coffee. We've got cattle to move this morning." She said it with such precise deflection that he laughed, actually laughed, and the sound filled the kitchen and she looked startled, and then she laughed too, and it was the first time either of them had fully laughed in each other's presence, and it sounded like something beginning. October deepened and the heat relented and the first autumn rains came. They came on a Tuesday night, slow and steady, the best kind, not the crashing downpours that eroded and ran off, but the long, gentle soaking rains that went into the ground. Henry lay in the barn, still in the barn, still maintaining a proper and careful distance because they were building toward something, and he was not going to rush it, and listened to the rain on the roof. And in the morning he went to look at the ditch. The water was running. It moved through the channel in a steady brown sheet, carrying the first of the seasonal flow down the 400 yards from the draw, spreading at the check dam and filling slowly along the outlet into the Stock Pond Depression. It was not yet a pond, barely a pool, but water was collecting and holding where no water had collected before. Etta stood beside him and they watched it without speaking, and then she reached out and took his hand the way she had that night in the moonlight, and he held it. "Thomas would have wanted to see this," she said. "I think he'd be glad you got it done," Henry said. She squeezed his hand once and released it and said, "Let me see what the cattle think of the new water." She went to open the pasture gate, and the cattle moved toward the pool with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of animals who understand, at a fundamental level, that water is good. The first snowfall came in November, light and early, just enough to make the land look different for a morning before it melted off. Henry had, by this point, been on the Double K for nearly 3 months, and the question of what exactly his situation was had been circling closer in small ways. In the looks the Montoya family exchanged when they visited, in the careful questions Milo Hatch asked when he came for dinner, in the way Etta and Henry moved around the small house with a domestic ease that had developed so gradually that neither had fully noticed it becoming what it was. He had fixed the barn roof. He had built a proper corral extension for the horses. He had reset the kitchen door frame, which had been hanging crooked since before Thomas died. He had helped bring in and store the autumn hay bales that would carry the cattle through winter. He had done all of this because it needed doing, and because the land was beginning to feel, in a way that was both frightening and right, like something his hands belonged to. One evening in November, when the first real cold had come and they were sitting close to the kitchen stove after dinner with cups of coffee, Etta said, without preamble in that direct way she had, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me honestly." "Always," he said. "If I asked you to stay not just to help, not just for the winter but permanently, would you want to?" Henry looked at her over his coffee cup. "Etta," he said carefully, "the only thing that's been keeping me from asking you that question first is the fear of being premature." She looked at him. "How premature do you think you'd be?" "Apparently not very." She set her coffee cup down and turned to face him fully on the bench and said, "I've been thinking about this for 2 months and I want to say it clearly so there's no misunderstanding. I love you. I am not certain exactly when it started, or if there was a single moment, but it has been building since you drove that torch into the ground, and I am not a person who says a thing like that and doesn't mean it." Henry put down his coffee cup and turned toward her. The stove was throwing warm light and the snow outside was making the night very quiet. He said, "I love you. I have loved you for long enough that I've been having to be careful about it every day." He paused. "I don't have much to offer you in the way of material things. I have my skills and my willingness and my $42 minus the 15 I spent on lamp oil and nails." She said, "You have yourself, which is what I'm interested in." "Then yes," he said, "I want to stay permanently." He reached out and took both her hands. "Will you marry me, Etta Kendrick?" She looked at him steadily for a moment, and her eyes were bright and clear and certain. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, Henry Malone." He kissed her then properly, with both of them on the bench by the stove and the snow falling outside, and it was warm and sure and nothing performative about it at all, just two people who had built trust slowly and carefully together, and had arrived at love as a natural conclusion of that building. When they pulled back, she was smiling, and the smile was the one he had first seen that evening on the front steps, full and warm, and revealing the woman inside all that capable steadiness. "I'm going to need to tell Milo," she said. "He'll be insufferably pleased with himself," Henry laughed. "Why?" "Because he told me the week you arrived that you had honest eyes." She picked up her coffee cup. "I told him that was not a useful observation. He said it would be." She sipped her coffee with an expression of profound false neutrality. He was right. They were married in December in Cimarron in the small stone church on the main street on a cold and brilliantly clear winter day. The Montoya family came, all of them, including Ramon's mother, who was 72, and had opinions about everything, and approved of Henry on the grounds that he was quiet in the right ways and loud in the right ways, which she stated directly to his face. Milo Hatch was there in his Sunday suit, his white beard neatly trimmed, looking indeed insufferably pleased. Carver had sent a congratulatory letter from Santa Fe. The circuit preacher, a thin, weathered man named Reverend Price, who conducted services in 6 different towns and knew the territory as well as any man alive, performed the ceremony with the particular sincerity of a man who had seen too many difficult lives and was always glad to officiate at something hopeful. Etta wore a dress she had made in the weeks before, dark blue wool, fitted and neat, and she had let her hair down for the occasion, which Henry had not seen before, and the sight of it undid him in a quiet way that he thought he would remember for the rest of his life. She stood next to him in front of Reverend Price and said her vows in a clear and steady voice, and he said his in a voice that was not quite so steady because he was feeling the full weight of the moment. And when Price pronounced them married and he kissed her there in the small stone church with everyone watching, he heard Milo Hatch make a sound that was suspiciously close to a sniffle, and he loved the old man for it. They went back to the Double K that evening, just the two of them in the wagon with the winter stars very bright and the horses blowing steam in the cold air. And Etta sat close against his side with her head on his shoulder, and they did not talk much on the ride home, because they were both simply present in the moment, inhabiting it fully. The homestead in winter was beautiful in a way Henry had not expected. The land that had been baked and dry and hard in the August heat was transformed, the arroyos holding ribbons of ice, the mesquite studded with frost in the mornings, the sky a deep cold blue that went on forever. The cattle were doing well. The stock pond had held water through the fall and was now frozen at the edges, but full enough in the center to be of use on warmer days. The barn was solid and the house was warm, and there was enough hay put up to carry them to spring. Henry and Etta worked through the winter as they had worked through the fall, in rhythm with each other, competent and complementary, each one's strengths fitting around the other's without effort. He was better with the horses and the heavier physical work. She was better at the accounting and the correspondence and the forward planning. They were equals at the cattle work and the daily running of the property, and they both worked hard, and neither one resented the other for the same. But what Henry had not expected, and what quietly moved him every day, was the quality of being known. Etta knew him, the real shape of him, the history and the failings and the things he was still working through, and she had chosen him anyway, with full information, and that fact made him more himself than he had ever managed to be before. He found himself talking more, saying things he had not said to anyone, and she received these things without alarm, fitting them into her understanding of him the way a careful person fits pieces into a puzzle. And he knew her. He knew the weight of the grief she still carried and how it had changed shape but not disappeared. He knew that she was afraid of drought and of financial precarity and of being alone, not the temporary aloneness of a night, but the deep aloneness of being the only one who cares about something. He knew that she was fiercely intelligent, and that she read everything she could get her hands on, and that she had opinions about territorial politics and land rights, and the treatment of the Pueblo communities, and the Apache bands that were being pushed further and further from their land by the same forces that had pushed the Montoya family off their grazing pasture. She spoke about these things with a passion that was carefully managed but real, and Henry listened and agreed and asked questions that made her think, and she loved him for the asking as much as for anything else. February brought a late snowstorm that kept them inside for 3 days, and those 3 days were among the best of Henry's life. The small house full of warmth and the smell of bread baking and the sound of Etta reading, aloud from the newspapers that Milo brought on his last visit, a lively annotated reading in which she frequently interrupted herself to dispute or affirm what she was reading, and Henry sat by the fire mending harness and listening to her voice and thought, "This is what I put out the torch for. Not just the land, not just the right thing, this exact thing." In early March, Etta told him she thought she was going to have a baby. She told him at the kitchen table in the morning with a directness that was entirely herself, no performance, no elaborate build-up, just, "I believe I'm expecting, I'm not certain yet, but I believe so." Henry looked at her across the table. He felt something enormous and bright move through him. He said, "How are you feeling?" Nauseated every morning, tired earlier than usual, otherwise well. She paused. "Henry, are you?" And for the first time in a long time she looked uncertain, not about the fact but about his reaction to it. "Come here," he said. She came around the table and he stood and held her, and she felt him shaking slightly the way she had shaken in October when the letter from Carver came, the body releasing what the will has been holding. He pressed his face against her hair and said very quietly, "Thank you." "That's a peculiar thing to say," she said, muffled against his shoulder. "I know." He pulled back and looked at her. "I want you to see the doctor in Cimarron as soon as the road is clear enough." "I will," she said. "I'm not fragile, Henry. I know you're not fragile. You're the most capable person I've ever met. I still want a doctor to tell you you're well." She accepted this as reasonable and patted his chest once with the flat of her hand. "Sit down. The coffee is getting cold." He sat down and she sat down, and they looked at each other across the kitchen table in the March morning light, and the day outside was cold and bright, and the Double K was quiet except for the sound of the cattle in the pasture and the horses in the barn, and Henry thought the word home with a fullness he had never assigned to it before. Spring came with the particular force of Plains springs, fast and forceful, the land going from brown to green in what seemed like a week, the water draw running high and strong, and the irrigation ditch carrying its first full flow of the season down to the stock pond, which filled and spread and became, by late April, exactly the stock pond that Thomas Kendrick had planned, and Etta Kendrick had surveyed, and Henry Malone had helped build. The cattle thrived. Etta had 12 head going into winter and 14 coming out of it, because 2 cows had calved in January, and Henry had been midwife to both calvings in the cold barn at 2 in the morning, and Etta had stood at his shoulder with the lantern and talked him through the second one, which was positioned wrong, and the calf had come out alive and wobbling and bleeding, and they had stood in the barn in the winter dark looking at this new animal with the kind of shared wonder that the Wild West, for all its hardness, still provided if you were paying attention. Milo Hatch came in April with news that Carver had successfully argued the Montoya grazing claim at the territorial level, and that Greer's wire on the eastern draw pasture had been formally ordered removed. It had not been removed yet. These things moved slowly in the territorial bureaucracy, but the order was in place, which meant it would be removed, and Greer knew fighting it further would cost more than it was worth. Ramon Montoya came to tell them that himself, riding over on a spring morning when the land was so green it seemed impossible, and he shook Henry's hand with both of his and said, "Carver said you were the one who suggested he take our case." "Etta suggested including you," Henry said. "I just said it was worth asking." Ramon looked at Etta and then at the obvious roundness that had appeared beneath her work dress. She was nearly 5 months along by then, clearly and healthily pregnant, and he said something in Spanish that Henry didn't entirely follow, but that made Etta smile and reply in Spanish that she had been using more and more, having been practicing it with Consuela through the winter. Consuela came around from the wagon and embraced Etta with the warmth of a woman who has been waiting for this particular piece of news and said, "When?" "July," Etta said, "or thereabouts." Consuela looked pleased and said she would come when the time was near, and that she had delivered 12 babies including her own sister's 3, and that Etta should not argue about it. Etta did not argue about it. Henry, watching this exchange, felt once again that particular kind of gratitude that had no object except the general fact of good fortune. He thought about the torch. He thought about how close it had come to being different, how easy it would have been to follow through, how different the trajectory of not just these lives but all of these lives would have been. He was not a religious man in any formal sense, but he thought about it the way a man thinks about a narrow road and a long drop, the sheer probability of wrong versus right, and felt a kind of grateful vertigo. The summer was busy and good. The cattle operation was functioning well with the water access, and Henry had begun improving the breeding stock by trading 2 older bulls for a younger one through a connection Milo had in Cimarron, and the pasture with the stock pond was better than any grazing land within 10 miles, because the water meant the grass grew deeper and thicker. Etta was managing the books and showing, month by month, that the Double K was profitable at a modest but real level enough to make the bank payments comfortably and put something aside. She had also been writing letters, primarily, to a newspaper in Santa Fe, contributing observations about land policy in the territory, about the situation of small homesteaders against large ranch operations, about the ongoing displacement of communities like the Montoyas who held their land by use and tradition, and were perpetually vulnerable to those with lawyers and money. She did not sign them with her name initially, using only "a settler of the Pecos Valley," but eventually she signed them, because she decided that anonymity was the tool of people who needed to avoid consequences, and she had made peace with consequences. 3 of the letters were published. Carver wrote to say they were being read in Santa Fe, and that the territorial representative from the Cimarron district had asked who had written them. Henry read each published letter with the same expression, quiet pride, something that was almost wonder at her. She caught him once, reading the 3rd one, and said, "What?" He looked up. "You are remarkable," he said simply. She said, "I just wrote what's true. Most people don't." She looked at him and then looked away with a slight color that meant she was moved and managing it. "Don't make me sentimental before dinner." The baby came on the 17th of July, 1883. It was a long labor, nearly 14 hours, and Consuela was there as promised, and the doctor from Cimarron arrived by mid-morning, and Henry spent most of the labor outside on the porch in the July heat, doing every useless thing a person does when someone they love is enduring something they cannot help with. Walking in circles, drinking too much coffee, talking to the horses, checking the cattle for no reason. Milo Hatch arrived around noon, having heard from the Montoya boys who had ridden to tell him, and sat with Henry on the porch and did not say anything except occasional practical things, which was exactly the right thing. When the baby cried, Henry stood up fast enough to knock over his coffee cup. Consuela appeared at the door and said, "A boy, both well, come in." Henry went in. Etta was propped against the pillows in the bedroom, flushed and exhausted and absolutely alive in the way that exhaustion sometimes reveals rather than conceals all the brightness of her fully present. She had the baby in her arms, wrapped in the white flannel she had prepared 2 months ago, and the baby was red and squinting and making a sound that was half complaint and half inquiry. Henry sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the 2 of them and did not try to say anything for a moment. Etta looked up at him, and her eyes were bright and full, and she said, "He has your nose." Henry looked at the baby's face and found it impossible to identify anyone's nose with certainty. "He looks like a potato," he said gently. Etta laughed, surprised and tired, and then winced because laughing was not entirely comfortable just yet. "A very handsome potato," she said. Henry reached out and touched the baby's hand with one finger, and the baby's fingers closed around it with the automatic grip of the newborn, fierce and certain. And Henry looked at those small fingers around his calloused one and felt something so large and clear that he had no word for it. "Thomas," Etta said quietly, "for a middle name, if that's agreeable to you." He looked at her. "More than agreeable. What for the first?" They had talked about names in the months before, going back and forth through the things that were meaningful. She said, "I thought James Thomas Malone." "James Thomas Malone," Henry said, trying the name in the air of the room. He looked at the baby. "What do you think?" The baby, James Thomas Malone, expressed no opinion but kept his grip on Henry's finger, which Henry interpreted as acceptance. "James it is," he said. He looked up at Etta, and she was looking at him with that unguarded expression she had, the one without performance, the one that showed the full depth of what she was. He leaned forward and kissed her forehead gently, and she closed her eyes for a moment and then opened them. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" She looked at him steadily. "For putting out the torch." He looked at her and then at the baby, and then at the room around them. The small adobe house on 40 acres in the Pecos Valley. The kitchen where they had eaten 1,000 meals and talked about everything that mattered. The view through the window of the pasture where the cattle grazed and the stock pond that held good water, the land that was theirs, and he said, "Thank you for handing me the shovel." Outside, Milo Hatch was so loudly pleased about the baby that they could hear him through the wall, and Consuela was making something in the kitchen that smelled like the best thing in the world, and the July sun was hot and brilliant over the Double K. The years after that were full ones. James grew from a red squinting potato into a brown-eyed boy who was loud and curious, and who had, clearly, his mother's stubbornness and his father's way with animals. By the time he was 2, he had a decided opinion about every horse on the property, and by 3, he was following Henry around the corral with his arms out for balance, and his boots entirely too large for his feet, narrating what he saw in the half-formed sentences of a child learning that language exists to describe experience. Etta's letters kept being published, and eventually she was writing for a Santa Fe paper under her own name, once a month, about land and water rights and territorial governance, and the particular conditions facing women homesteaders. She was not the only one writing such things, but she was among the clearest and most specific, because she knew the subject from the inside, and because she had the kind of mind that could make an argument without heat and a fact without mercy. Milo Hatch became a fixture at the Double K in a way that was somewhere between neighbor and family, appearing every 2 weeks or so with supplies from Cimarron or news from town, staying for dinner, playing with James in the evenings with the patient delight of a man who never had children of his own and has found grandchildren in a neighboring family. The Montoya family got their eastern pasture back by the spring of 1884, when the territorial order was finally enforced and Greer's wire came down. Greer himself, as if punctuating his defeat in the territory with a final exit, sold his main ranch operation to a cattle company from Denver and left the Pecos Valley by the fall of that same year. The news arrived in Cimarron on a Wednesday, and by Thursday it had reached the Double K, and Etta heard it and nodded once and said, "Good," and went back to what she was doing. Henry was checking the fence along the north section, and he did not hear the news until dinner, and when Etta told him, he put down his fork and sat with it for a moment. 11 months of his life working for that man. The night with the torch. All the distance between that night and this dinner table. "Does it feel like something?" Etta asked, watching him. "Like something that was wrong is fixed," he said. "Not dramatic, just corrected," she nodded. "That's exactly right." They ate dinner. James, 2 years old at the dinner table in his high chair, was engaged in a private and passionate dispute with a piece of cornbread, and it required both of their attentions before the dispute was resolved in the cornbread's defeat. In the summer of 1884, when James was just over a year old and walking with considerable energy in all directions, Etta told Henry she was expecting again. This time he was not shaking. He looked at her across the kitchen table and smiled a slow, full smile that she said later was the best she had ever seen on any face, and said, "Well, the Double K is going to need more fence," she said. "It's going to need more everything, more garden, more cattle, a proper second bedroom." "All of those things are achievable," he said. "I know they are," she said. "We've achieved harder." He reached across the table and took her hand. She turned it palm up under his and held on. They built the second bedroom that fall, Henry and Esteban Montoya framing it out from the side of the house with good lumber from Cimarron, adobe bricks that Henry and Etta made together in the summer heat, a window facing east toward the draw. It was a proper room, bigger than the first bedroom, because they had learned from the first time what space a child required, and because Etta intended that both children would have room enough to grow. The second baby came in February of 1885, in the middle of a windstorm that rattled the windows and made the horses nervous, and Consuela was there again, and the doctor from Cimarron arrived an hour after it was over because the wind had slowed his progress, and he checked everyone and declared them all in excellent health and shook Henry's hand. It was a girl this time, small and dark-haired, and already looking at the world with the kind of focused attention that suggested she had been paying close attention before she arrived, and was continuing to pay attention now. Henry held her in the lamplight while Etta slept, and the wind was outside doing its loud work, and James was asleep in his room, and the house was warm and full, and the baby looked up at him with eyes that were dark and clear and already specific. He said very quietly, so as not to wake anyone, "Well, Margaret Rose." Welcome to the Double K, Margaret Rose. They had decided Margaret for Etta's mother, Rose because Etta had said she wanted something that sounded like the land when it was at its best. Etta had opened her eyes partway and heard him and said, her voice drowsy and warm, "She's going to be trouble." "The best kind," he said. Etta made a sound that was half laugh and half sleep and turned her head into the pillow. And Henry sat with the baby in the lamplight and listened to the wind, which had no concern for the warmth inside the house, and was glad to be on the right side of it. By the spring of 1886, the Double K was a different place than the 40 acres of dry clay and rock that Henry had ridden onto in August of 1882 with a torch in his hand. The irrigation ditch had been maintained and improved, and the stock pond was full and permanent, and the cattle herd had grown to 32 head, which was 3 times what Etta had managed when she was alone. There was a proper barn, not the small weathered structure of the original homestead, but a larger one that Henry had built over 2 summers with help from Ramon and Esteban and Milo. The house had its second bedroom and a covered porch along the south side where you could sit in the evening and watch the pasture and the draw, and the sky do all the things the sky did over the Pecos Valley, which were many and often magnificent. The debt to the First Territorial Bank of Cimarron was fully paid off in March of 1886, 4 years ahead of the original schedule. Etta drove to the bank herself and made the final payment and received the clear deed to the land and drove home with it flat on the seat beside her. Henry was fixing the porch railing when she pulled up in the wagon. He came to take the horses and she climbed down and held the deed out to him without speaking. He looked at it, then at her. She was 43 years old by then. No, wait. She was 33. She had been 29 in 1882, and this was 1886, so she was 33. And she was exactly as brown and lean and capable as the woman who had stood with a lantern in the dark 4 years ago. But there was something different in her face now, not less serious, but less guarded. The fortification of the alone years gradually replaced by something that came from being deeply known by someone who stayed. He looked at the deed for a long time. The land description, her name, the clear stamp of the Territorial Land Office. Free and clear, he said. Thomas would be glad. Yes, she said, he would. She took the deed back and held it against her chest for a moment. And so am I. James came running around the corner of the house at that moment, 3 years old and moving at the full speed of a child who has discovered that legs are for running, and collided with Etta's skirt, and she caught him and picked him up, and he said something urgent about a lizard he had seen near the barn, and the moment opened into the ordinary afternoon in the way that important moments always do, not with ceremony, but with the continuation of everything else. Henry watched his wife and son and thought about the torch again, not with guilt now, because the guilt had been acknowledged and absorbed and transformed into something useful, but with a kind of clear-eyed understanding of how close things can be to going wrong, and how the difference between wrong and right sometimes comes down to a single choice, and whether you are willing to make it. He had been willing. She had been waiting. They had built something real together on difficult ground. That evening, Etta put James and Margaret to bed, James requiring 3 stories and a negotiation about whether the lantern could stay lit, and Margaret at 11 months old requiring only milk and warmth and the sound of her mother's voice. And then she came out to the porch where Henry was sitting in the evening, and she sat in the chair beside his, and they looked out at the pasture together. The sky over the Pecos Valley was doing one of the things it did best, laying out a sunset in colors that went from gold to rose to purple in a gradient so clean and vivid it looked deliberate. The cattle were moving slowly in the far pasture, dark shapes against the last of the light. The stock pond caught the sky and held it. Etta said, "I want to tell you something." He looked at her. She said, "The night you came here with the torch, I was more frightened than I showed. I stood outside because I thought if I looked frightened he would do it, whoever it was, and if I looked calm maybe there was a chance. I didn't feel calm." "I know," he said gently, "but I had decided that whatever happened I wasn't going to give up the land, not for Greer, not for fear, not for anything. Thomas and I chose this place, we put work into it. My hands made that ditch." She paused. "And then you put out the torch, and I thought, well, that changes things a little. Just a little." He said, She turned to look at him, and the evening light was warm on her face, and the smile was there, that full particular smile. "Quite a lot, actually," she said. "It changed rather a lot." He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the arm of the chair, and she turned her hand and laced her fingers through his. "I've been thinking about next spring," she said. "Ramon thinks we could extend the ditch east along the draw. There's enough grade for another 200 yards if we go carefully, and it would double the water access for the pasture." "I've been thinking the same thing," Henry said. "We'd need a second check dam further up the draw, and the rock there is deeper. It would be harder work." "We've done harder work. We have." The sky was going from rose to purple now, and the first stars were appearing above the dark line of the mesa to the east. Somewhere along the draw a coyote called once, sharp and questioning, and was not answered. "Henry," Etta said, "are you happy?" He looked at the sky, and the cattle, and the stock pond holding the last of the light, and the land that was theirs, free and clear, and then at the woman beside him who had handed him a shovel on the worst night of his life and trusted him to use it for something good. "Yes," he said, with the simplicity of a man who means it completely. "I am happier than I knew was possible." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat together in the evening air of the Double K, with James and Margaret asleep inside, and the cattle settled in the pasture, and the water running quiet and steady in the ditch they had built together, and the stars coming out one by one above the Pecos Valley like things that had always been there and always would be, waiting to be seen by people who were paying attention. The Double K stood for a long time after that, through dry seasons and wet ones, through hard winters and good springs, through all the complicated history of a territory becoming a state, and a state becoming a place, where the old contests of land and water and right were fought in courts, instead of in the dark with torches. Etta's letters became a column, and then a series, and she was known in the territory as a voice on the side of the small and the overlooked, and her opinions carried weight because they were never uninformed and never dishonest. Henry became the man that people in the valley came to when they needed a fair assessment of a land problem or a water situation, not because he had a title or authority, but because he had worked the land himself and had learned everything it had to teach him, and because his judgment was trusted by people who didn't trust easily, which was the best kind of trust to have. They had a third child in 1888, a boy they named Samuel, who arrived in July on a day so hot that the air shimmered above the pasture like glass, and who grew into a quiet boy with an exceptional talent for mathematics that mystified both his parents and delighted his mother, and who eventually went east to school, which was a complicated and proud thing all at once. James grew into a young man who was all of the things his parents were, stubborn and capable and honest and better with animals than with words, which the land did not consider a deficiency. He loved the Double K with the unconscious total love of someone who has never known anywhere else to be home, and he came into the cattle work early and naturally and well. Margaret Rose was, as Etta had predicted, trouble of the best kind, fierce and smart and impatient with limitations, with a talent for argument that made the dinner table a lively and sometimes exhausting place, and who announced at the age of 12 that she intended to be a lawyer, which Carver, who had become a family correspondent by then, said was an excellent ambition and not beyond possibility. And Henry had looked at Etta across the dinner table, and she had looked back at him with an expression of such pure fond recognition. "She is yours," that expression said, and mine, that he had had to look at his plate for a moment. Milo Hatch died in the winter of 1891, at the age of 62, of a heart that had simply worked as long as it intended to and then stopped. He died in his own bed at his own ranch, and was found by his hired hand on a cold morning, and the burial was on his land because that was what he wanted, and that was what he had told his lawyer years before. Henry and Etta and all 3 children came to the burial, and Ramon and Consuela came, and a dozen others from across the valley who had known Milo as the particular kind of steady presence that only reveals its full weight when it's gone. Etta stood at the grave and said, very simply, that Milo Hatch had been the kind of neighbor that the word was invented for, and that they would not replace him but they would carry what he had given them, and everyone there knew what she meant and nodded. Henry thought about the flour sack. The loan written on good paper, at 0 interest, that had helped them fight Greer and win and stand, and all the meals and all the evening visits and all the times Milo had appeared with exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment, as if he had been paying close attention to what was needed. He was not a man who cried easily, but at Milo's grave in the winter cold, he let himself feel it fully. The years continued to be full and good and difficult in the ways that good full lives are always difficult, and Henry and Etta grew into the middle of their lives with the particular ease of people who have built something real and know it. The arguments they had were real ones, about money when money was tight, about the children's education and what it required and how to provide it, about the occasional disagreements that arise between two people who are both deeply capable and therefore sometimes both certain they are right. But the arguments resolved because neither of them held grievances and both of them had learned, from different hard schools, that the important thing was not to be right but to be honest, and honesty was something they could always find their way back to. On the evening of their 10th anniversary, December of 1892, Henry and Etta sat on the covered porch of the Double K as they had sat so many evenings, watching the cattle in the pasture and the sky do its evening work above the Pecos Valley. The children were inside making noise that suggested something being cooked either competently or disastrously, and the sounds were warm and good. Etta said, 10 years. 10 years, he agreed. She looked at him sideways. You're still digging, he looked at her. Still digging, he said, every day. She reached over and took his hand. He closed his around it. The porch was warm from the last of the autumn sun, and the evening star was up over the mesa, and the stock pond in the far pasture caught the last of the light and held it, the way good things do. Inside, James called out that dinner was ready, and his voice was that of a young man now, no longer a child, carrying across the evening air with the particular clarity of the desert. Henry stood and offered his hand to Etta, and she took it and stood, and they went inside together to their table and their children and their life, which was, by every measure that mattered, more than either of them had thought possible on the night. A man came to burn down a widow's claim, and she handed him a shovel, and he started digging instead. The Double K stood long after that. The ditch carried water through wet years and dry ones. The stock pond never fully dried, not even in the hard droughts of the dry years that came in the middle part of the decade. The land was worked and known and loved, season after season, year after year, and the title was clean and the debt was paid, and the stars above the Pecos Valley were exactly as thick and bright as they had always been, pressing down against the darkness with patient, particular light.